When Ruth went back to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "What happened to my daughter?" Ruth told Naomi everything Boaz had done for her, and she added, "He gave me these 6 scoops of barley and said, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.' Then Naomi said to her, 'Just be patient, my daughter, until we hear what happens. The man won't rest until he has settled things today.'" Now that's how Ruth chapter 3 ended. And last week, we saw how that very morning how it went. Boaz went right to the city gate, didn't he? And he made arrangements to marry Ruth and to redeem the family land. So now, as we pick up our story in Ruth chapter 4, verse 13, the narrator fast forwards, if you will, over the next 9 months. Their first 9 months of marriage. So let's see what happens in verse 13 of chapter 4. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. So the narrator reveals a miraculous answer to the prayer that was prayed in verses 11 and 12. If you back up just a little bit, let's glance at verse 11 of chapter 4. This is right after Boaz announces that he is going to be the kinsman redeemer. And the witnesses, there's elders and there's others at the gate. It says, verse 11, all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses." And then they pray this prayer, "The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the 2 who built the house of Israel, and may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem." Then they say, "May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman." So they pray this prayer of blessing over Boaz and Ruth, knowing that Ruth was married to Mahlon in Moab, and there were no children. But now they pray, "May you have offspring." And so God answers the prayer. This is a miracle, and the narrator is modest about this, but it's a miracle nonetheless. God opens a barren womb. We don't know how long Ruth and Mahlon were married, but there were no kids. Some commentators believe they were married almost the whole 10 years. So, my question, pausing here, is this: do you still believe in miracles? Do you still trust that God is able and God is at work, even if it's been 10 years? Well, let's see what happens. Verse 14, then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel, and may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is better to you than 7 sons has borne him." Now, this is lovely thoughtfulness and care and concern on the part of these townswomen, isn't it? They love Naomi, and they are praising Yahweh. "Blessed be the Lord," they say in verse 14. They're praising Yahweh for providing a goel, or a kinsman redeemer. It says close relative. My Bible has a little footnote there, and if I look at the footnote, it says a redeemer, a goel. So God has provided a kinsman redeemer. But did you notice who the kinsman redeemer is? See, we know that Boaz was willing to be the kinsman redeemer, but as they go, they look at what they say: "Who has not left you this day without a kinsman redeemer. May his name be famous in Israel." And then you get all the way down to the bottom of verse 15. Who's the kinsman redeemer? Obed, the son, the child that has been born to Ruth and Boaz. So Obed is not going to be a kinsman redeemer in the sense of he's going to purchase back land. Boaz has already done that. But Obed, this is going to be tough. Even in the practicing, Boaz and Obed became together, and it gets all messed. I think I called someone Noba at one point when I was practicing. We'll try to avoid that now that I just said it. Obed will become the redeemer in the sense of providing for Naomi. Look at what the townswomen, how they word this. They say in verse 15, may he be to you a restorer of life. Now that word is beautiful, restorer. Back in chapter 1, do you remember, over and over again, we had a word, return. It's the word shub. That's this word. May he be a returner of life. Just as Naomi has returned to Bethlehem, returned to God's blessing, so Obed is going to be that returner of life for Ruth, for Naomi, for this family. A restorer, a renewer. And then they go on, secondly, they say, a nourisher of your old age. Now, I love this. That phrase, nourisher of your old age, it's literally a sustainer of your gray hair. That's fantastic. You read that and you go, is that a blessing that God sustains the gray hair? But then it may be a blessing if you're losing the gray hair. I don't know. We're going to let that go. But they're saying, may he be a nourisher, a sustainer, a supplier in your old age. It's beautiful. There is hope. There is hope being placed on a little baby here, isn't there? Sounds a little like Christmas. Well, they keep going. They pray, may he be this restorer of life, a returner of life. May he be a nourisher, a supplier for you. And they're being very specific. This is tangible. May he provide food for you is the idea here. May he take care of you. And then they're also praising Yahweh for the gift of the daughter-in-law. And they say, the daughter-in-law who loves you. And that word love, see, in our world today, love, we may shift towards the Valentine's Day and the red hearts. But in their language here, they're saying who loves you. That's an expression of covenant commitment. She has committed herself to you. And we've seen it. If you look back at chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, look at Ruth's commitment to Naomi. She says, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from you, from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Ruth says to Naomi, where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. Then she invokes Yahweh's name. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. See, Naomi made a commitment. I am for Yahweh, and I'm for you. Now, throughout this little story, she makes that commitment in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, we've seen her live that out. She's been living out, and we've said this word over and over again, hesed. It's that beautiful word of steadfast, loyal love. It's loving kindness. She's been committed. And Moses has told Israel how they should live a life of hesed, how they should live a life that pleases God, right? In Deuteronomy 6:5, we know this verse well. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Leviticus 19:18, Moses said this, you shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but what? You shall love your neighbor as yourself, because God is the Lord. Now, we know those verses so well. Why? Because Jesus repeated them in the New Testament, didn't he? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's what Ruth has been doing. She has loved Yahweh, and she's been faithful to him in how she's been living, and she has loved her neighbor. She's loved her mother-in-law. She's been faithful to her, and she's served her, and she's been committed to her. But it gets even better, if you can imagine. Just a few verses later, in Leviticus 19, verse 34, Moses says this, the stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself, or you shall love her as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So as Moses is preaching, and he's telling Israel how to live, he's saying, remember, you were foreigners in Egypt. And so when God brings foreigners to you, you need to love them. But what happens in the book of Ruth? Ruth is the stranger from Moab. Ruth is the one that models this to the Israelites. How beautiful is that? And then Boaz, he jumps in as well and says, no, I'm going to obey too. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture. And the townswomen, they praise Ruth for it. Look at what they say. They say, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without this kinsman redeemer, and may his name be famous in Israel. And then they say, may he be to you a restorer of life, a nourisher of your old age. And then they say, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons. That's the ideal Israelite family, a complete family, 7 sons. And they say, Ruth is better. God's gift to you of this daughter-in-law. Wow. It's a beautiful blessing. The townswomen give a beautiful blessing to Naomi. What they're doing is they're recognizing, they're noticing, they're recognizing, they're speaking out loud, they're giving God credit for refilling an empty Naomi. Do you remember chapter 1? She has come back to Bethlehem. She's struggling with bitterness, and she says that she feels empty. But God is refilling her, and the women are recognizing it, and they're praising God for what he has done. And so that leads me to wonder. We're entering into a season of Christmas. How are we doing as a church with praising God? How are we doing with giving God the credit for the work that he's doing in our lives and in the lives of people around us? Are we praising God to the extent that he deserves? Are we praising him in our own quiet, personal times with him? Are we praising him publicly? Do you praise God to your friends? Do you praise God in front of your friends? Do you give God the credit for what he is doing in your life? See, when we praise God, when we honor him, he receives the worship that he is due, and then that worship grows in our community, doesn't it? It grows. It's the complete opposite of allowing complaining and murmuring to grow. Are we praising God? Well, what happens next? Verse 16. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. And also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi. They called his name Obed. There we go. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So, what happens in verse 16? Naomi takes the child, and we see this beautiful picture of affection. She holds the child close, and she becomes a nurse to him, meaning she becomes the nanny. She is an active caregiver in Ruth and Boaz's life. What a help. What a beautiful picture. Then we get to verse 17. In verse 17, the narrator, it's as if they take that camera lens that's been zoomed in on this little family, and the camera lens all of a sudden zooms out to this wide angle view, and we see Obed will be the father of Jesse, and Jesse will be the father of David. And for the first hearers of this story, this is a mic drop moment. This is a showstopper. They're going, what just happened? This is the family line of King David? There's this lovely story, this rescue of Naomi, this journey of this Moabite daughter-in-law who loves her and who's committed to her, and then this noble landowner who goes beyond the law to express hesed to Naomi and to Ruth. All of that is actually the backstory to King David. That's what's going on here. So, the narrator then, in verses 18 to 22, elaborates with a fuller genealogy. So, look at verse 18. Verse 18 says, now this is the genealogy or the generations of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Aminadab. Aminadab begot Nahshon. Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz. And Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. Hopefully that sounds familiar because Juan read that just a few moments ago, didn't he, in Matthew chapter 1. So beginning with Perez, the author names 10 significant family members before concluding with David. So, David is the final word in the book of Ruth. So what that's doing is that's showing that literarily the author is giving us this perfect segue from the book of Judges, which is right before Ruth, and the book of Judges ends. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And now we have this amazing story of faithful, committed love, of sacrificial love, but it ends with David. God's at work in these individuals to provide a king who will also love God and love his people. Not perfectly, but God's king. God is at work even in a dark time like the day of the Judges, and we see the backstory. So for Israel, they would have seen God's veiled hand of providence. It's now they can see it at work. This is incredible because this is a story where a family line almost died out. Elimelech, Mahlon, Chilion, they all died, and there was no more sons for the family line to be carried on. In chapter 1, we have a story with widowhood. We have famine. We have refugees. We have barrenness. And into this story, God says, no. This is the royal line. I have a plan. I'm at work. And for us, incredibly, it's even greater than this resulting in King David. Why? Because of what Juan read earlier. This is the genealogy of Jesus. So this family line that includes Judah and Tamar and Rahab and now Boaz and Ruth, we know it also results in an engaged couple in the books of Matthew and Luke, Mary and Joseph. This is the line that Jesus will be born into. This is Jesus' family. These are his ancestors. So, think back on the last 5 weeks and all that we've been reading in the book of Ruth. God has been at work. When Ruth went out and happened to end up in the field of a close relative, God's at work. When Boaz shows up and happens to notice Ruth, God's at work. When Boaz goes to the gate and Mr. So-and-so happens to show up that morning at just the right time, God's at work, isn't he? All these seemingly luck events, they're all part of God's plan, and they're all part of God's plan not only to produce a godly king that will lead the nation of Israel, but to eventually produce Jesus, the Redeemer, who will rescue people from their sins. It's amazing. So as we consider the whole story, I'd like for us to reflect and think about 2 questions specifically. First is this: are you willing to disappear? That may sound like a strange question, but think about what the narrator does several times in this story. This is a theme the narrator weaves in. Look at verse 13. Verse 13, he says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife." Ruth is named in verse 13, and then she disappears. She's identified again as a loving daughter-in-law in verse 15, but she's not named again. The story moves to Obed, and then the story moves to King David. Ruth, in many ways, at the end of our story, she disappears. Not only that, in verse 1 of chapter 4, we meet this friend. Boaz says, "Come aside, friend, sit down." And we shared last week that name, friend, it's the phrase Peloni Almani. It's a phrase that came to mean so-and-so or such and such. It's one translator, one commentator would like it to be translated Joe Schmo. He's nameless. We call him Mr. So-and-so. See, he tried to save his name. Look, in verse 6, the close relative, Mr. So-and-so, says, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You do it." He chose not to redeem Ruth and Naomi, to try to save his own inheritance, his own future. He was trying to preserve his own family name, his own hard-earned dollars. But what ended up happening to Mr. So-and-so? He disappeared. He tried to save his name, and no one knows his name. He's Mr. So-and-so now. But Boaz, he was willing to disappear. Boaz was willing to give his name away. Boaz was willing to be the redeemer. So what happens? In verse 17, Obed is born. Obed he's going to be the father of Jesse. Jesse's going to be the father of David. But look at verse 21. As the narrator gives us this generations from Judah, he starts with Judah's son Perez in verse 18, goes all the way down to David in verse 22. But look at verse 21. Salmon begot Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed. So who's the father of Obed? It's okay to answer. Who's the father of Obed? Boaz. Who's supposed to be the name in verse 21? Mahlon. Think about what happened last week. Boaz said, I am willing to marry Ruth, and I'm willing, if God provides a son, that first son will take Mahlon's name so that Mahlon's inheritance, Mahlon's family line does not disappear. Think about what's happening here. This is almost the opposite of adoption. In adoption, you invite a son, a daughter into your family, and you give that son or daughter your name, right? But in this case, what's happening? Boaz is actually going to father a son. He's going to bear the responsibility of raising that son, providing for that son, but he's going to give that son the other guy's name. Obed is in Mahlon's family line. How incredible is that? But what does God do? God says, no, I'm going to put your name, Boaz, into the genealogy. Boaz was willing to disappear. He was willing to give his name away. And God says, no, I'm going to preserve your name. One commentator said it this way: authentic lines of blood have won out over legal fiction. The legal thing to do was for Mahlon's name to be in this genealogy. But God said, no, we're going to do it my way. We're going to put Boaz's name. And not only here, but it's also in Matthew. And so, in the end, Boaz is willing to give his name away, and God writes him into the lineage of not only King David, but who else? King Jesus. So here's the question for us that I'm asking. Are you willing to disappear? Are you willing to love others so sacrificially that you don't get the credit or the honor? Maybe God's opening up an opportunity for you at Christmas that you can love someone else sacrificially and no credit is given to you at all. Are you willing to disappear so that God can be glorified? Are you willing to leave every bit of recognition in your life in God's hands and you just serve? You serve others and you lovingly put the needs of others above yourself and you let God work it out. Are you willing to disappear? And then the second question I'd like to ask is this: are you willing to trust that God can use you? Are you willing to trust that God can use you? In this story, Ruth is just simply amazing. Now, I suspect that most, if not all of us, know and love Ruth's story. It's a story that hopefully we're familiar with. But I hope in these last few weeks, your respect for Ruth has grown. Mine has. She is an amazing, amazing person. Her virtue in this story, it's beautiful. Her selfless love for Naomi, her firm devotion to Yahweh. But as we read the story, we have to recognize in that culture, in that society, Ruth should have been a nobody. According to them, she was a barren widow. She's from Moab. In chapter 2, she calls herself someone who's unnoticed. That was her role in that society. She is someone that was overlooked. She was unnoticed, except Boaz noticed her. She's tagging along to Bethlehem with another destitute widow. They have no social status. They have no financial resources. As chapter 2 begins, Ruth goes out to glean. So you see this young woman, she's scavenging for scraps. And God opens up his storehouse of blessing to Ruth and to Naomi. You may feel like a nobody this morning. You may feel like God has overlooked you or others are overlooking you. You may feel like wherever your station is in life, it may be you're feeling like, well, I'm not really being noticed, but it's partially my fault. Maybe you've messed up and you feel like you are now paying the bills for the decisions that you've made. It may be that you feel like the consequences that you're having to deal with now are higher than they should be. Maybe the consequences that you're dealing with are actually from decisions that other people have made, and you're having to pay their debts. But I think it's impossible to read this story well and not see God's hand at work in the overlooked and in the unnoticed. If we've learned anything from this story, we have to admit that God has been at work from the very first pages. He's at work in the background, even when those in the story, they couldn't see it. And so sometimes there's moments in our lives, I think, that it can be very difficult for us to see God's hand at work. But that doesn't mean that He's not at work, right? And so my question is, are you willing to trust that God can use you? The point of today, verses 13 to 22, is that we need to see God's bigger plan, and we need to trust Him in the now. God is at work in a much bigger way than likely any of us can recognize with our little camera lenses, right? God had a plan. Of course He had a plan for Naomi and for Ruth and for Boaz. We've seen that throughout the story. Now when we get to verse 17 and we get to verse 22, we see, well, God had a plan for the nation of Israel and King David too, didn't He? But not only that, because of the book of Matthew, we know that God had a plan for Jesus to come through this family line as well, to come and save the world. It's what we're celebrating today. And as Pastor West began our worship gathering, reminding us God is still at work in this unstoppable plot. And that's why we have hope, because of God's unstoppable zeal. Did you see those words on the screen? I love that. God's unstoppable zeal to rescue us. That's God's grace. God's grace is unstoppable, and because His grace is unstoppable, we have hope. We have hope. That's why we're here. But not only that, think about this. There's two levels of this that are just absolutely amazing. First, God rescues people, and not only that, but God sometimes uses us in His plan to rescue people. There's two levels here that are just mind-blowingly cool. Isn't this amazing? So let's see how He does this. God sees Ruth's heart, and He pulls her into His story, and He redeems a woman that in that culture would have been unnoticed, and now the whole world knows Ruth. And it's great news for you and me, because it means you don't have to have a great family name. You don't have to have great genes. You don't have to have a great pedigree. You don't have to be an early bloomer with amazing potential. God can use you. First, He can rescue you and redeem you, and then He can use you for His glory. And it's never too late. It doesn't matter if you're 8 or if you're 80. God's still at work, isn't He? And God's still doing miracles. And so the question is this: are you willing to trust that God can use you and that He can redeem you as you are now? Do you believe that God can write an amazing story in your life? Do you believe that? If you think about Ruth, I don't believe that Ruth had any idea that King David was going to be born from her. I don't think she had any idea. I don't think Ruth had any concept that God was writing her into the royal line, not only of King David, but that she would get to be the ancestor of the Messiah. And yet God's amazing like that, isn't He? See, God sees where your story is going far greater than you can and than I can. And He's at work. And that's why we have hope. We have hope because of who He is. It's not our power. It's not our strength. It's not our wisdom. It's His. And so we need to cling to Him. And so here's my question. Will you trust him again? Will you trust him for the first time? Will you trust him anew? And in so doing, specifically, let me ask you, will you give your life away to God? And I mean this today. Will you give your life away to God? Will you say to God this morning, it's all yours. I am all yours. I'm opening up my hands to you, maybe for the first time, maybe again, but you're saying, I am all yours. I commit to you. I will obey you. I will cling to you. And I leave all of the outcomes. I leave everything in the future. I leave it up to you, but I am all yours. Will you give your heart and your life to him and trust that he will redeem, he will rescue, and he will use you for his glory? And then, let's get even more specific, will you seek to love others? Think about Ruth and Boaz. Will you love others unconditionally? Will you look out for foreigners? Will you look for those who are gleaning? And will you recognize them? Will you look for the needy that God brings into your path, and will you put their needs ahead of yours instead of looking away and hoping somebody else will help them? Would you bow your heads and close your eyes? I'd like for us just for a moment, I'm going to repeat some of these questions, but I'd love in the stillness of your own heart and your own mind for you to answer these questions quietly to God. Are you willing to disappear? Will you take that to God right now? Are you willing to believe that God can redeem your life and use you for his glory? Would you open up your heart to God and ask him to forgive any sin in your life? Ask him to redeem you, rescue you, wash away that sin? Are you willing from this point forward to risk obedience and give your life to God in full commitment? No matter what he has in store tonight, tomorrow, will you cling to God regardless of the circumstances? And will you release your future to him? Father, we need you. We don't have the power, we don't have the wisdom, we don't have the strength. But we know and we recognize and we remember that you do. And we thank you for this beautiful story. Father, would you help us to trust you more? And it's in your precious Son's name we come to you. Amen.